This is the book of Isaiah, chapter 19, and I'm going to start at verse 1. And it says, the burden of Egypt, behold, the Lord Yahweh rideth upon a swift cloud, and shall come into Egypt. And the idols of Egypt shall be moved at his presence, and the heart of Egypt shall melt in the midst of it. Verse 2, and I will set the Egyptians against the Egyptians, and they shall fight everyone against his brother, and everyone against his neighbor, city against city, and kingdom against kingdom. I want to give all honor, all glory, and all praise unto Yahweh, Bahashem, Yahweh Shai, Bahashem Rakakwadash. Double honors unto the elders of the nation of Israel. Shalom to you brothers out there that are laboring, enduring the elements, making your body a living sacrifice, trying to seal the elect, making your call and election sure, seeking out your own salvation, as well as you sisters that are learning, listening, applying, being obedient to your husbands. Shalom, shalom. Once again, it's the brother Zachariah coming back to you with another lesson here on this Sunday afternoon, and Lord willing, this be edifying. Okay, so I started off here with Isaiah, the 19th chapter, all right? And you see the word Egypt, but this is not talking about what we know as the land of Egypt, all right? But this is talking about spiritual Egypt, as in this place, America, all right? Babylon the Great. It has many nicknames and aliases, all right? And one is it being spiritual Egypt, all right? As well as spiritual Sodom, which I was going into that in another lesson I did yesterday, all right? But this place is spiritual Egypt, all right? And then I want to talk about like pretty much the division, not so much in what's happening here, but also but them fighting their brothers and within other countries, which we know it's going to lead to you know, biblical prophecy being fulfilled. All right, but again it says, and I will set the Egyptians against the Egyptians, and they shall fight everyone against his brother, and everyone against his neighbor, city against city, and kingdom against kingdom. All right, you know, which is crazy because they have this slogan when you think about here Babylon the Great, you know, aka United States, all right, which nothing is united here right now. And we know all this is the doings of Yahweh Ba'Shem Yahweh Shah, which he said he will set up divisions. All right, but it says united we stand, divided we fall is a famous maxim emphasizing that collaboration brings strength and success, whereas conflict and isolation leads to failure. All right, and you're seeing more and more conflicts. You're seeing more isolation. Nations who once were together, now they're like, okay, look, we ain't fucking with you. We doing our own thing. You know, we don't trust you, or we look at you as an enemy or an adversary. You're seeing these things, which all this is biblical prophecy, okay? And for those that have eyes to see and ears to hear, we can all see this and link it to what the Bible is speaking of, all right? So yeah, there's nothing united about this place. So, you know, it says united we stand, but divided we fall. Okay, we know that Yahweh said that he is bringing what? Division upon this earth. So that's going to lead to what? A great fall. All right, especially Babylon the Great. But you know, the scriptures, throughout the scriptures, you hear it talking about Babylon falling, Babylon falling, Babylon has fallen. All right, but I wanted to pull this up real quick because the focus is not just on Babylon, but the fact with their allied nations, which, you know, the EU, NATO, all that. Okay. And it says President Donald Trump has not formally withdrawn the United States from NATO, but his administration has repeatedly threatened. Okay. So they're sending that threat to leave and has actively begun pulling major U.S. military resources, which we'll get to that, all right, in another article, and assets away from the alliance. Okay, so you see that this is where what is starting to happen. So these scriptures that I was going into, and hey man, it's coming to fruition. All right, but he's sending out the threat of like, look, we'll just leave. Okay, this is Proverbs 15:1. It says, a soft answer turneth away wrath, but grievous words stir up anger. All right. And the thing about Trump is he got a mouth on him, all right? There's a lot of people, we all know somebody like that. You know, they can't control their mouth, and they'll say something, and then boom, you know, and if you somebody who's a hothead or something, they might run their mouth, and then boom, you hit them in the mouth, and then all of a sudden they want to play all innocent, like, you know, but they will say something, you know, talking crazy. Like, for an example, you know, you might have a Jake and he called another man a bitch. You know, that's an insult. And Jake, you know, that's just as bad as like talking about somebody's mama. You know, they be ready to throw hands. You know, but you call another man a bitch, that dude's more than likely gonna punch you in the mouth. All right. So that's an example of like how Trump is. This dude, he can't control his mouth, and he say things and try to stir up stuff. You know, but he ain't ready for what the people he talking about, what they gonna do to him. You know what I'm saying? But again, Proverbs 15:1 says, a soft answer turneth away wrath, but grievous words stir up anger. Okay. Verse 2, it says, the tongue of the wise useth knowledge aright. Okay, so us in this faith and this truth, we control our emotions. We watch what we say, how we say it, because hey, every idle word you got to give an account thereof too. So you got to be mindful of all those things. All right, but the mouth of fools poureth out foolishness. Okay, and that's definitely Esau, because he is he's losing that wisdom. You know, as it tells you in the scriptures, it talks about, is there no more wisdom in Teman? All right, which Teman is part of Edom, where Esau is from. So, you know, those are parables. You know, when you read that, it's talking about Esau and him losing that wisdom. Because, you know, the scripture said that this dude was more wiser than Daniel. Okay, because see, he's in rulership. All right. But I got this from BBC. Okay, that says Trump calls NATO allies cowards over Strait of Hormuz. So that's another example. So he's calling his fellow brethren. All right, you know, they all Edomites. They just different tribes. But he's calling his allies, all right, cowards over the Strait of Hormuz, because you know they're having the ongoing conflict and war between Iran. You know, with Israel also involved. But he was trying to get them to come in and help it. But he also was bragging about how they don't really need their help. If they don't need their help, then why even ask in the first place? But I guess he tried to make it seem as if we asked just to see if you guys will step in and also help. You know, but they're like, look, we didn't ask for that problem. You know, you guys are stepping in doing this, and look what it's doing. All right. But he's like, it's not like we really need you. We're winning it anyways, you know, which they're not. I went into an article yesterday. I actually ended my highways with Iran saying they already won. You know, and they're doing Esau how Esau be doing people. All right, so it's all coming back on them. Because, see, that's what they do. Even though the war ain't even over with, they already be claiming victory. Well, you got Iran saying they won, you know. Okay, and it's just not looking good for, and then you got Israel declaring war on other nations now, Turkey and Egypt, all right. But again, it says Trump calls NATO allies cowards over Strait of Hormuz. So these are grievous words, man. All right, and then they take it in even a step further, like we was reading earlier, you know, about them pulling, threatening to leave NATO, but also pulling away assets and things like that. Well, I have this article here, and it says Washington plans cut. All right, and NATO assigned forces, including jets, bombers, and submarines. So they're gonna start pulling back some of their stuff, you know, from NATO. Like, oh, like we're taking our things and all this. Okay. Just like what he's doing here in Babylon, he's taking away funds and stuff and the aid from the people. Using that money that was being poured into these different funds, he's taking it away to fund it into the military. Now he's taking all those that equipment and assets and things away from NATO, which is his allies, so away. Because see, they're going to step away from NATO, all right, which is probably going to be one of the biggest mistakes they ever made. But hey, we encourage it. We love to see it because we know what that's going to lead to. We'll get to that. All right, but again, it says Washington plans cut and NATO assigned forces, including jets, bombers, and submarines. All right, y'all, this is the book of Mark, chapter 3, starting at verse 24. It says, and if a kingdom be divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. Okay. Verse 25, and then a house be divided against itself, that house cannot stand. All right, and we're talking about as a whole, collectively, the house of Esau, the kingdom of Esau, all right, which all those tribes collectively are a part of that kingdom, that house, all right, not just here in Babylon, but them as a whole, they're divided, all right. So again, and if a house be divided against itself, that house cannot stand. Verse 26, and if Satan rise up against himself and be divided, he cannot stand but have an end, all right. And we know All right, y'all. So this is some information right here, and I just got it pulled up on Facebook. But it says half of Belgium sees the U.S. as a bigger adversary than China. Okay, all right. Up here, over 50% of Belgians view U.S. as an adversary, meaning an enemy. Okay. All right. Belgian poll found over 50% of Belgians now view the U.S. as an adversary, compared to just 10% who consider it an ally. Damn. Hey, it's not looking good for Babylon, all right? And if you know anything about Belgium, Belgium is on that list when we talk about the 10 heads, all right? But a lot of these nations, they're getting fed up and they're getting mad. You know, Babylon, all right, what I was talking about, that is of the eighth and gone into perdition. They had that perdition also as a part of that wine, all right? They went out there with that wine, that golden cup. And all these nations, including their fellow brethren, they all drunk of this wine, man, that's been pushed throughout the earth. That's why there's no kingdom like Babylon the Great. This place right here, this is all those ancient kingdoms wrapped into one, all right, and it's very wicked, all right? But it says, Babylon had been a golden cup in the Lord Yahweh's hand that made all the earth drunken. The nations have drunken of her wine, therefore the nations are mad. Okay, so now they're starting to get fed up, and they looking at this place like, you know, you're an enemy. You're not what we thought it was. At first we looked at you and we thought, okay, you know, everything's cool. But now they're looking at them as an adversary, and this is of their own people. So they're divided, which we read that kingdom divided cannot what? Stand. Okay. Oh, and it don't stop there, because it's not just Belgium, all right? But it says some Europeans see U.S. as a bigger threat than China. And see, what we read, it was going into Belgium. But look at what this article goes into. It says people in 6 European Union countries view the U.S. more as a threat than as an ally under Donald Trump's presidency. So they see it now under the, the rulership of Donald Trump, okay? Which he's really just a puppet anyways, okay? You know, he's purposely put in there. They're not going to have anybody in there they don't want. Okay, but it says Politico, a Brussels-based politics and policy news organization, as reported by a European provider. All right, it says details. It says in March, only 12% of respondents in Poland, see there's Poland, look, Spain, Belgium, France, Germany, and Italy considered the U.S. as close ally, while 36% perceived it as a threat. Okay, it says China was seen as a threat by 29% of the respondents in these countries. Okay, it says on a national level, concern about Washington exceeding concern about Beijing in 4 countries, with only respondents in France and Poland viewing China as the greater threat. It says Russia was widely seen as an obvious enemy, with 70% of respondents. Of course, they're going to do that. All right. It's identifying it as a threat. It says Spanish respondents were the most negative towards the U.S., okay, with 51% saying Washington posed as a risk to Europe, the highest proportion among those surveyed. And it's no coincidence why Israel, all right, which really is control of Babylon the Great, they're clashing with Israel right now, Spain and Israel, okay. It says in Italy, 46% consider the U.S. as a threat, 42% in Belgium, all right, and it says in 30, which is now up to 50, which we read in that article, okay, 37% in France and 30% in Germany, okay. Poland, which borders Russia, sees its alliance with the U.S. as a key security guarantee, all right, was exception. Only 13 said the U.S. posed as a risk, okay. So, hey, but ultimately, these countries are now looking at Babylon like, you know, we don't know about you no more, all right? You know, that wine is wearing off. But we know these are the doings of the Heavenly Father, okay? This is Luke 12:51. It says, suppose ye that I have come to give peace on earth. All right, I tell ye nay, basically saying no, all right? It says, but rather division. So it ain't bringing peace on earth, but rather division. All right, so that's why we're seeing these things transpire. Now, I want to go here real quick, okay? And this is, many brothers, like you see the boards and things, brothers out on the highways and hedges, and they're showing you, all right, the beast with 7 heads and 10 horns. It says, and the 10 horns is NATO, all right? Absolutely, you know? And there's a lot of information on this, all right? And you can see all the different names and stuff on there, all right? You can see British, But over here, when you go into the 10 heads, it's kind of blurry, but you can see like some of those names that were mentioned in that article. That's why I say keep those names in mind. But look, you got Belgium, you got Denmark, France, Italy. Okay, a lot of those were named. Okay, there's one up here. I can't see that one. Netherlands, Greece, Spain and Portugal, England, Ireland, and West Germany. So a lot of those names were mentioned. And if they weren't mentioned, they were mentioned in other things where Trump sent threats, talking about a lot of his allies. What's he talking about? He's talking about them. All right, which goes into your those 10 heads. So, and like I said earlier, grievous words stir up anger. All right. So all this is not going to end up well for Babylon the Great. We know that these divisions is all the doings of the Heavenly Father, which he's a man of war. And this is a war tactic. OK, he says, you know what? I'm going to put division in them because we know that a divided nation cannot stand. All right. But have an end, you know, like, and they've said it themselves. Esau knows. This way says, united we stand, divided we fall. But guess what? Ain't nothing about y'all united. Y'all are divided. While y'all are divided, we're becoming more and more united. And I'm talking about the nation of Israel, which consists of the so-called Negroes, Hispanics, and Native Americans. All right, we're coming back into unity, and it's those that are of the hopeful elect. All right, doing, what is pleasing in the sights of Yahweh Ba'Shem Yahweh Shai. All right, making our call and election sure, and Lord willing, we be of that precious number. But we're coming more and more united when you guys are more and more divided. Because see, they cut us off. We were divided and we fell, but now we're rising up. All right, because you're at your end, and see, and we as a nation are going to be the beginning of that cometh. All right. So yeah, these nations. All right, talking about the 7 heads and the 10 horns. All right. It all goes back to this, all right, which is the book of Revelations, chapter 17. I'm starting at verse 16, and I'll go ahead and close it out with this. Like I said, it wasn't intended to be a very long lesson, but I was going into this a little bit in my highways, but I knew I wanted to elaborate just a little bit more, in the spirit, because we know that they're going to play a big part, and not just the 10 horns, but many other nations as well. Because hey, when we read in Jeremiah about the nations being mad, it ain't just the nations of the other nations, allied nations of Esau, but many of these other heathen nations as well. They have drunken of the wine. It says all nations have drunken of our wine. Russia, all right, Iran, North Korea, China, Japan, all these other nations, and a lot of them are all going to look at this place with evil eye. Even them Hamitic nations, Ham, everybody, they're all going to be like, man, they got us, and they all going to be looking at this place, and they're going to turn on this place. Okay, even the Amalekites, all right, who truly really are pulling the strings, they're going to turn on this place. All right. This is Revelation 17, starting at verse 16. And it says, in the 10 horns which thou sawest upon the beast, all right, these shall hate the whore. So they're going to hate the whore, all right, Babylon the Great, aka America. It says, and shall make her desolate and naked, all right. It says, and shall eat her flesh and burn her with fire. And that's going to be that nuclear destruction that we've all been bringing out. We've been showing you, with visuals, all right, and art, all right, and ultimately the Holy Scriptures, right, in these lessons. All right, so again, it says, in the 10 horns which thou sawest upon the beast, these shall hate the whore, and shall make her desolate and naked, and shall eat her flesh, and burn her with fire. Verse 17, for Yahweh hath put it in their hearts to fulfill his will, showing you men's goings are of the Lord Yahweh. All right, and to agree, they're all going to be in agreement on this. See, everybody divided, but they're going to be in agreement on this one. All right, and give their kingdom unto the beast until the words of Yahweh shall be fulfilled. Call all Yahweh Ba'Shem Yahweh Shai. I want to give all honor, all glory, and all praise unto Yahweh Ba'Shem Yahweh Shai Ba'Shem Rekakwadash. Double honors unto the elders of the nation of Israel, and shalom to you brothers and sisters out there. And to the next one, shalom.